Hello and welcome to another tutorial from ProTechReviewGroup.com. This one's going to be a two-parter, and we're going to go through Photoshop's blur filters and take a look at them one by one and break down what they do and what their differences are. And on our website you can see a comparison chart to compare all the different blurs. And while we're at it, I'll show you a couple of tutorials on how you can use select blurs. So let's get started. So the first type of blur we're going to talk about is the average blur, and that's one of those blurs that was up in the menu that I, for the longest times, would see, and I had no idea what it meant or what it did, so I didn't bother doing anything with it. There are a couple of practical applications for the average blur that you'll get great use out of, I think. So let's talk about it. What the average blur does is it takes all of the colors in your image, or on the layer that you're on, or in the selection that you have at the moment, and it averages them together to give you a final smooth color. So I'll quickly go up to Filter, Blur, Average, and you'll see we're getting an average of our scene there. Let me undo that just for a moment to show you a couple of other things here. I'm going to use my Quick Select tool to just make a selection of grass here. I'll add the shadow too. And now I'm going to add the average filter, and now you'll see it's just averaging the sections in my selection. Again, I'm going to undo, and I'll make another selection. Let's see, I'll do his shirt and coat here and see what we get. So now we're going to filter average blur, and now we get obviously a bluer, kind of a bluish gray average. So what on earth can we do with that? Well, this filter is great for removing noise and even textures from an image, and there's a great tutorial on the link that you see on your screen now that's up on YouTube about removing texture from an image, and I'm not going to duplicate that because it's already done. It's a great tutorial, so check it out if you're curious, but I'll show you quickly what you can do. Let's duplicate our background layer by holding Command J. I'll just make a selection of the grass again with my Quick Select. I'm not going to make it perfect for the purposes of this tutorial, but we'll get our grass section. I got a little too much tree there, so I'm going to hold Alternate or Option on the Mac and just delete a little bit of that tree. A little bit more. Okay, that's close enough. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is create a layer mask. Well, actually, I lied. First I'm going to filter, blur, average, and then I'm going to select the inverse. So I'm going to go ahead and create a mask. So all that's showing of the bottom layer is this section. And I'm going to change my blending mode to overlay, and it doesn't look great. You can see the differences. This is before, this is the after, but of course we could lower our opacity some. But what you'll notice is happening is you're getting a more uniform color of green all over. So off here we have all the different shades of green. There's some light areas, some dark areas, and this is sort of evening things out, kind of this limey green. I may lower the opacity more if I was actually using this. To be honest, I don't use this filter for that method too often, but on occasion I do. What I tend to use the average blur for is this. I'm going to switch images here, and you might notice this image right away that there is a very bad green color cast, and the average blur can be used to remove that color cast. Typically we might go into like our color balance and try to remove the green or remove the red, or you could go into your info palette and do it with levels, probably the correct way, but sometimes that way can just be a pain in the butt. Sometimes you don't have time. So how can we do it? Well, let me get rid of this color balance. I'm going to duplicate my layer, and on this layer I'm going to go ahead and create a filter, blur, average blur. Now I'm going to apply a levels adjustment layer, which is right here in the levels, in the adjustment layers palette. Okay. Now with our gray color picker, I'm just going to select here, and it's going to choose this color to make a neutral gray. So there's a neutral gray. Now all I have to do is turn off our middle blur layer, and the adjustment has been done. And you might not notice a huge difference. It's not perfect, but it is way better. So let me turn off our levels. There's the original image. Watch the white on the wall where the green color cast is. When I turn the levels back on, now that wall is much more like a pure white. So really, I do think this has done a great job. This isn't the best image, but it was an image that I had that had a color cast that I thought would be great for the purposes of this tutorial. So next we're going to take a look at the Blur and Blur More filters and take a look at what they do. These are like Photoshop's auto blurs basically, and I rarely, if ever, use these filters, but they're handy to have just in case. If you go to Filter, Blur, and I just choose Blur, you're not going to notice a huge difference, and that's because what Photoshop's doing is it's attempting to locate significant color transitions, and that's a quote straight off their Adobe website help files for Photoshop. But again, they're locating significant color transitions, and it's just blurring the pixels in those areas, sort of to smooth out transitions between colors and to eliminate noise in those areas. Again, I've already applied the filter, and you really can't tell much of a difference. But to experiment with that a little bit, let me undo it, and I'll duplicate my background layer. And I'm going to go ahead and add the blur filter a couple of times. So blur, blur. Actually, I'll go ahead and add it 4 times. There's 4. So I'm going to zoom in here to our image. By the way, you can zoom by holding alternate or option and just scrolling in with your mouse. And then if you hold space bar, you'll get your hand and you can drag up and down. So here is the image with the blur, and I'll turn off the top filter, and there it is without the blur. Again, here's with, without. Very, very subtle difference. I'm not even sure if you can see it on the screen. But let me go ahead and delete that layer, and I'll just duplicate again, and this time we'll do the Blur More filter. So what does the Blur More filter do? Well, it does exactly the same thing as the blur filter. It locates significant color transitions. The difference is it applies that blur 3 to 4 times stronger than the blur itself does. So what I just did, adding blur 4 times, I could have just done basically by adding Blur More 1 time. Okay? But what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and add Blur More 3 more times. That's about the equivalent of adding 16 regular blurs. Okay, so there's 4 Blur Mores. Now let's see at the full image size if we can tell the difference now. Here's with the blur, here's without. Again, very subtle difference. I'm going to go in here where there's a fairly significant color transition. Let's pay attention to where the brown switches to green here in the leaf. The blur is on right now, and now it's off. Again, on, off. Very, very, very subtle difference, and again, you may or may not find a use for this, but feel free to leave comments below and let me know if you do use this or not. So the next type of blur we're going to take a look at is box blur. Now what is box blur, you might ask? Basically a box blur blurs pixels based on the pixels around it, basically in a box, hence the term box blur. And you can actually see the boxes if you have the level set low enough. So let's take a look here at blur, box blur, and let's set the radius down. Well, actually you can already see it there. Radius at 80 pixels. If I zoom in, the blur looks very boxy. As you go higher and higher, that tends to go away somewhat. But well, let me just show you. Box blur, I'll really boost up the box blur, and it's still there. Check out the comparison chart at the bottom of the page and you'll see the difference between this and a Gaussian blur or this and a lens blur. But you get the idea. It's kind of a very unrealistic blur. So let me go ahead and show you what we might do with something like this. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate my layer, and I've got a selection already saved that I'm going to go ahead and load called leaves. I'll go ahead and load that. And I'll go ahead and quickly feather the selection. I'll go about 20 pixels. And I'm also going to select the inverse. You can find that up here under the select menu or by holding Shift Command I. And what you'll notice is you've got now a line around the outside of your image, which means I've not selected what's inside of my original selection, but instead I've selected what's outside of it. So I'm going to go ahead and do Filter, Blur, Box Blur. And I'll just set it fairly low, but something just funny, something kind of cool. No, actually, let's crank it up just for fun. And we'll say OK, and we'll unselect, or we'll deselect. And now you can see I've got this crazy image of my son standing there with kind of a funky blurred background. I think you can see right away why you wouldn't want to use this kind of blur for simulating depth of field. That is best reserved for lens blur or possibly Gaussian blur, which we'll take a look at very soon here. But so that's the box blur. Okay, so the next type of blur we're going to talk about is Gaussian blur or Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur is the one that I see the most on the internet. I see people using it in tutorials, and for good reason. It really is a nice looking blur, which you'll see in a few minutes. Quick background. Gaussian blur is called Gaussian blur because it's based on Carl Gauss. Gauss is the man who came up with the lens formula that we now today call the Gaussian lens formula. And basically the mathematics behind this blur are that it's based on a Gaussian function. That's as much detail as I'm going to go into it about that. But the blur basically is a bell curve, and it averages pixels based on the frequency of their color. By frequency, I mean the wavelength. And because of that, Gaussian blur is what's called a low-pass filter. Basically what that means is the blur affects colors that have a high frequency first, such as violet, blue, and then lower frequency colors like red are affected last. But more specifically, where you'll notice this happening is that the whiter areas get blurred before the darker areas, because whiter areas are all colors, so that's a high frequency, and blacks are no frequency. So you'll see what I mean here. I hope that makes sense. But let's take a look at the Gaussian blur. So again, you can crank up the radius, and that's just telling Photoshop how wide of an area to use for your blur. Much cleaner blur. You don't see the boxy look, and you'll notice that our white areas here are blurred already, and our darker areas are somewhat blurred, but they're more intact, like I was talking about. That's this low frequency. You can really see that start to happen here. Start to notice a blur in this white area, and not as much in the blacks, although it's not extremely noticeable. But the bottom line is this Gaussian blur can give you this kind of a hazy look to it. So what do we use Gaussian blur for? Okay, so one of the things that Gaussian blur is commonly used for is to remove noise or grain from an image. And I don't have an image that's too bad right now, but I will at least show you how to achieve the effect in case you want to. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And you can do that by holding alternate on your keyboard and then scrolling with the scroll wheel on your mouse. So we're into 55%. I'm going to hold space bar down, and I can click and drag around the image now. So I'll sort of show you what I mean here. What you would do is first let's duplicate our background layer and shut off the background. And we'll apply our filters to this new layer. So let's go ahead and filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Now the key here is not to blur too much, because we don't want to blur the image. We just want to remove any kind of noise or grain that may have been there, say from a scanned image or whatnot. Sometimes you want to retain that grain, and other times you don't. So a real subtle radius, real low radius rather, would be the best thing. So I'll go a little overboard, so hopefully you can see it on your monitor. I'm going to go 3.1 for now, which, like I said, it's a little bit too far. But I'll go that far, and I'll click OK. And there we have a much smoother image already. I'll show you the difference so far. I'll solo the background layer. There's our original, and here's our blurred layer, which there obviously is some blurring going on. So a common thing to do at this point would be to have another layer of another version of our original. So I'll just do that below the original layer, and then to create a mask on our blurred layer. Or just paint black in the areas that you don't want any blur, like the eyes. It's a good idea to unblur the eyes. So I'll get my brush tool, and I'll just lower this down, and I'll just paint over the eyes. We want the eyes to be sharp in all images. Well, I shouldn't say all. There may be some there may be some images where you don't want it done. But you can see the difference there already from the blurred to the unblurred there. So there we go. That's looking better. Now the other thing that this is commonly applied with is a high pass filter to sharpen things back up. So now I'll go ahead and duplicate this layer, and I will apply a filter other high pass. And the goal here is not to apply too large of a radius. If you go too high, you see, pretty much most of the image. But the high pass filter is allowing higher frequency colors to show through, and everything else is just getting turned to a neutral gray color. So just enough that some things shine through there. There we go. Let's go 4.4. Apply that, and then we just take this top layer and turn it into an overlay layer. And I'll show you the difference here. That's with it off, that's with it on. It's pretty subtle, but there is definitely a sharpening effect going on there. Typically what you do then is reduce the opacity then to find a look that suits you. But I think you get the idea. I'll show you the overall before and after. Here's our original image, and here is our sharpened and noise reduced image. It's a real subtle difference in this case, but you'll definitely notice a much more drastic look on images that actually contain some noise to begin with. So that's how to achieve that effect. The other thing I tend to use Gaussian blur for a lot is to bring focus to my image. So in other words, let me get rid of these background layers, and got our original layer there. All right, I'm going to duplicate our background layer. So I'm going to duplicate it one more time. And typically, let's just put an elliptical marquee around him, and I want to bring focus to my sun and de-emphasize the background slightly. So typically what I might do is add some adjustment layers. Let's feather out our selection first. I have to finish the first step before we move on. 75 seems good for now, and we'll punch a mask in the top layer. Okay. So I'm going to add a brightness and contrast just to make this simple. And I'm just going to lower our brightness. And I wouldn't go too extreme. You don't want this to look cheesy. I mean, you might want to, that's fine. But I just want to bring a slight focus to Nick there. I'm also going to lower the contrast just a little. And then I might also add another adjustment layer. Let's add a hue and saturation, and we'll just slightly desaturate that part of the image. Not too awful much. Then what we're going to do is on the top layer, I'm going to create a brightness and contrast layer. And you'll notice if I increase the brightness right now, it's affecting the whole image. So I need to clip that adjustment layer to this top layer, and I can hold alternate or option and just click right there in between the two layers. And now it's only affecting the center portion, just the layer right here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring down the brightness, and just from 0 I'm going to, I'll probably leave the brightness, but I'm going to boost the contrast a little bit. That people's eyes tend to be drawn to the things that are higher contrast. And then I'm also going to add a quick hue and saturation and just slightly boost the saturation. And already you can see a big difference. Here's the original image, and here's the focused image. But the last thing I would do is I would go ahead and blur out the background. And all the time I use a Gaussian blur for this effect. Blur, Gaussian blur, and we just want a subtle blur. I don't know that 1.2 is enough in this case. No, but I'm going to crank it up to maybe 3.4. Well, I'll go a little more extreme for this case. I wouldn't go this much if I was actually doing this for my image, but for the sake of this tutorial, so you can really see what's going on, let's go with 8.9. Okay, our original image looks like this, and our edited, blurred, and focused image looks like this. So I think that just really helps him to stand out there in the picture and draws your eye right to where you want it to go to. Original, focused. One side effect of Gaussian blur, and this also happens with box blur, is that, well, it's best if I demonstrate. Let's start fresh here. I'll duplicate the background twice actually, but I'm going to turn off this top layer and turn off the original. So let's say I've got a selection, and let's just say for some reason I want to blur this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that out, paste it to a new layer, and move it back into position. Turn off my bounding box or my transform controls. And that's looking okay there. We get the idea. You'll notice that already you see this transparent area showing through, and I don't even have a blur showing through yet. And the side effect with adding a blur to that layer is that as you blur, it actually blends with those transparent pixels, and it'll pull that transparent area in. So let's say I'm blurring out his face for some reason, but I don't want that blur to show through. That's the side effect. The solution is to either choose a different blur, like a lens blur, or you can take our original layer back on top, stick it just between the two layers, and turn it on, and there it's filled in those transparent pixels. So, or you could, alternately, you could just turn on your original layer again. But then it's becoming part of your image. So either solution there, but you're seeing the problem, and there's the solution. So that's the end of part 1, and we'll kick off part 2 with lens blur.